Hi readers. In this story set, we are moving into our last major established literary movement in the American tradition, if you can believe it, which is postmodernism. And postmodernism begins following World War II and carries us all the way up until today, which is not to say that all literature today is in the postmodern tradition, but the conventions of postmodernism really sort of permeate the ideas that we still see in literature today. So in every literary tradition we've talked about thus far, there are these very specific characteristics that I can give you that define the movement. Transcendentalism, there's the divinity of nature. Naturalism, there's determinism, and there are these characteristics that are very definable in the tradition. Now, postmodernism is probably the hardest to define because it is many things, and what I think a lot of those things boil down to is breaking the rules, challenging conventions, experimenting, challenging beliefs. It really becomes a period of literature in which we are sort of exploring the boundaries of what literature can be. So we're coming out of modernism, and if you remember, modernism takes place between World War I and World War II, and modernist writing is still very much in the realist tradition. Hemingway and Fitzgerald were writing fictional stories, but they were writing them in a way to where the characters felt real, their situations felt real. It was about real, authentic experiences that were going on at the time. Well, postmodernists following World War II start to question the very idea of what is real truth. What is, the true way to tell a story, and what is the true experience of people, and are there multiple truths to a story? So some characteristics that you'll see in postmodernism are things like paradox, ideas that contradict each other or expose, these sort of contradictions of beliefs or society. You'll also see a lot of skepticism. And for me, I think this is one of the overarching ideas, is skepticism about everything, questioning beliefs, questioning society, questioning politics, questioning literature, questioning everything becomes part of postmodernism. We also see a lot of dark humor, satire, parody, things like that. Intertextuality. There's a lot of, texts that are sort of speaking to each other. Experimentation is a big one. Experimentation with style, form, time. We see a lot of nonlinear time, things like that. And metafiction, which we will get into in a little bit more detail here in just a second. But I think it's helpful for postmodernism to conceptualize what's going on in the country during this period of time. So after World War II, we move into the postmodernist movement. So what's going on? Well, we have just experienced World War II, which, was a global conflict that was greater than we had ever seen before. We had also just gone through the Holocaust, one of the greatest human atrocities. The atomic bomb had been dropped. So we're entering this age of warfare that is catastrophic in ways that we had never seen before. We're also experiencing a generational shift as you move into the 50s and the 60s. This idea of the sort of conservative traditional family household, like the Leave It to Beaver idea of the 50s, moves into the 60s where you have, the age of free love and hippies and a lot of ideas that are sort of rebelling against those conservative expectations, conservative behavior expectations. We're moving into the civil rights movement with Dr. King and Malcolm X. We are starting to recognize there's just so much change, and technology is taking off. TVs, radios, music, things like that. There are all these sort of changes taking place in culture, in politics, in art, in the way in American experience. And all of those things influence postmodernism and questioning the established ideas of the country is part of what fuels that. So the first text that you are reading in the postmodern tradition is from James Baldwin. And this is a great way to segue from modernism to postmodernism, because we've just come off the heels of the Harlem Renaissance and Zora Neale Hurston, and James Baldwin was born in 1924 in Harlem. He grew up in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance. Now, just to clarify, he's not a Harlem Renaissance writer. He was a child during that period of literature. But he is very much sort of the legacy, the after effects of the Harlem Renaissance. So culturally speaking, following the Harlem Renaissance, you had a lot of conflict. There was a lot of discrimination. There were wars that had taken place. And so Harlem was this sort of celebrated place of culture and identity for a period of time. But then, there were a lot of troubles that hit the neighborhood. Things like crime, discrimination, poverty, drugs, those sorts of things start to, creep their way into Harlem. And James Baldwin grew up there, and as he becomes an adult, he sees all of these troubles in his neighborhood, and that's one of the things that his story Sonny's Blues is dealing with. Not only does James Baldwin connect to the Harlem Renaissance and modernism, but I think his sort of ethos also goes back even to, the previous set of stories that you read, particularly Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs. So James Baldwin, his mother was married to a Baptist preacher. He had a very religious upbringing in the church, and his relationship with faith and the church was a recurrent theme throughout all of his work. So this idea of religion and divinity and spirituality is something that has shown up in almost all literary traditions that we've talked about. As well, his grandmother was a formerly enslaved woman, and she had 14 children, some of whom were Black and some of whom had white fathers. And as you read about in Harriet Jacobs, this was an unfortunate reality that often befell enslaved women, was that, they would have children with their, the people who own them. And that was James Baldwin's grandmother. So in a lot of ways, I think James Baldwin can sort of represent the culmination of a lot of ideas we have seen so far. And Sonny's Blues, James Baldwin is a beautiful, brilliant writer in his own right, but I think Sonny's Blues is a particularly lovely story to illustrate that. So this is a story of two brothers who grew up in Harlem, just like James Baldwin did. And what I want you to pay attention to in this story is the idea of questioning things. Questioning beliefs, questioning society, questioning expectations, things like that. So there was this social idea that Harlem, which James Baldwin would often described it as the ghetto, there was this idea that if you got out of Harlem, if you made something of yourself, then you had escaped your circumstances. And this is, goes back to even the idea of the frontier hero and, the idea of sort of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and making it on your own. And James Baldwin was a very celebrated writer of the time, so he dealt with that perception himself. And I think one thing to think about in this story is how the story questions that idea of escape. The story deals with suffering and redemption and salvation and brotherhood and community. And not only do you want to think about how the story questions the idea of escaping your circumstances, you also want to think about whether the story questions whether we should want to escape our circumstances. Because yes, Harlem did have a lot of trouble at the time, and it did cause a lot of suffering and trauma for people in that community. However, there's also a sort of underlying loveliness and community and hope to the way that he represents Harlem, which again, we see this sort of idea of paradox. So before you read this story, I am going to include a short interview with James Baldwin where he talks about this idea of escape. I think it's helpful to get to set your mind up for what we're looking at in the story. And also, James Baldwin is just a brilliant, artistically gifted speaker. This is one of my favorite interviews from him, and I hope you enjoy it as well. And then in your next unit, we are going to get into postmodern war stories. And so in service of that, since this is your postmodern introduction, I do want to address the idea of what's called metafiction in a bit of detail. So metafiction is when an author calls attention to the fact that this story is fiction, that what you're reading is artificial, that they call attention to the fact that it is a story. If you've ever heard of breaking the fourth wall in films, this is when, for example, a character turns to the camera and talks to you and sort of calls attention to the fact that you're watching them in a movie. That's kind of what a metafiction is in literature. So these are stories that deal with authors writing about telling stories, talking about telling stories, talking to the reader, sort of breaking down that barrier between reader and writer. And to compare it to modernism, pretty much all literature up until this point, the idea is that you're to immerse yourself in it, sort of get lost in it and feel that it is, and sort of forget or not acknowledge that it is an imagined creation. And metafiction is the opposite. It calls attention to the fact that it is a creation, and oftentimes this is to make a larger, more symbolic, oftentimes abstract sort of point. And you'll see this idea of metafiction in your second story, which is from Grace Paley. This is a really short story, but it's a classic example of metafiction in which the narrator is having conversations with her father, who is dying, and they're talking about how to tell a story. And they're disagreeing about how to tell a story. And as she is writing about writing stories, she is also telling a larger story and making a larger point. And that's the idea behind metafiction. That will also come up again in postmodern war stories. So we'll dive into that in more detail. I look forward to getting into this last major tradition and starting to see literature that probably reflects what we see in our own culture today a little bit more closely, and I look forward to hearing what you think about the incomparable James Baldwin in your text this week.